He looked like just another old man on a rusty motorcycle, until 12 military Humvees rolled in and 50 soldiers stepped out to salute him. In a quiet Montana town where silence often means being forgotten, one moment shattered every assumption. Officer Dana Kelso thought she was protecting the community when she stopped Franklin Boon. What she didn't realize was that behind the worn leather gloves and unreadable eyes stood a living legend, a man who had led generations through war, only to return home seeking no glory, just peace. This is a story about misjudgment, redemption, and the powerful ripple of respect. A reminder that sometimes the heroes we overlook are the ones who carry the greatest weight, not on their shoulders, but in their hearts. The people in Montana weren't as loud as city dwellers, but their silences carried weight, like thick snow on a roof that could crush if you misread it. And in that stillness, Dana Kelso tried to stand firm. She kept her boots polished, her uniform crisp, and her posture as unshakable as the Rocky Mountains in the distance. She told herself that even in a place where cattle outnumbered crimes, the rules still mattered. Every stop, every citation, it all built the trust she believed a good cop had to earn. So when she pulled over the weathered Harley roaring down the two-lane road that morning, she didn't hesitate. To her, it was standard procedure. A bike with no visible plate, that was a stop. A rider who didn't dismount or speak immediately, that was non-compliance. She didn't know the man's name at first, didn't recognize the thick leather gloves gripping the handlebars or the posture that didn't quite belong to a frail old man. She just saw a potential violation. "License and registration off the bike now, sir," she repeated, her voice sharp with authority, her hand hovering near her weapon, ready but not drawn. Franklin Boon said nothing. He didn't flinch, didn't blink. He just stared past her, calm and still as if listening for something she couldn't hear. His eyes weren't confused. They were focused, like he knew what was coming long before she even sensed it. And then the dust came. It rolled over the hills like a tide. 12 military Humvees, engines growling like distant thunder, kicked up a wave of brown that swallowed the road behind them. The formation was precise, purposeful. 50 soldiers stepped out in perfect synchronization, boots striking the ground like drums in a funeral march. And from the lead vehicle, a single man disembarked. He wore full-dress uniform, his posture ramrod straight, eyes forward. Without a word, he approached, halted in front of Franklin Boon, and snapped a sharp salute. Who dared to stop Colonel Boon? The question wasn't asked with hostility. It was reverent, like a priest whispering a prayer at a grave. Every sound seemed to vanish. The wind died. Birds silenced. Dana's breath caught somewhere in her throat. She didn't know whether to step back or salute herself. Franklin Boon, 82 years old, retired and forgotten by most, remained motionless on his Harley, the weight of decades resting quietly on his shoulders. He lived a life stripped of ceremony, not because he had none to show, but because he'd already given all of it away in service. His farm just outside Billings was proof of that choice. 40 acres of Montana soil, wild and golden, hugged by weathered fencing and lined with memories. No banners, no polished trucks in the driveway, just a sagging red barn, a battered mailbox with the name Boone faded across the side, and the steady rhythm of a man who never sought to be seen. To those in town, he was the quiet hay farmer. Reliable, punctual, polite. They saw a man of few words and fewer smiles, someone you passed on the road and barely remembered, unless he raised a gloved hand in a wave so rare it made you wonder if you'd earned it. But they didn't see the mornings. At precisely 5 a.m. every single day, Franklin rose from his modest bed not because he had to, but because his bones remembered. He stretched, lowered himself onto the wood-planked floor, and did 30 push-ups in perfect rhythm, breath measured, mind clear. Not for strength, for discipline. Then he'd pull open the curtains and let the dawn pour in. He'd inhale deeply, Montana air filling lungs that once held their breath under enemy fire, and start the coffee. His home was quiet, 2 bedrooms, only one ever used. The other had remained untouched since Della passed. Her photograph, still resting on the eastern windowsill, caught the morning sun like it always had. He didn't speak to it, but each morning he looked. By 6:30, Franklin was already outside, tuning and fixing what others his age would have left to rust. His John Deere, a battered '78 model, rumbled faithfully under his care, its engine surviving through his patient hands. The Harley, his 1970 shovelhead, was more than a bike. It was a part of his soul. He rebuilt it himself, bolt by bolt, in the quiet hours of '93. Not for the thrill, but for the reminder to keep moving forward, to stay useful. Neighbors often asked why he didn't just stop, retire, travel, relax. He never gave more than a few words. Idle hands forget how to be useful. That was it. And behind the words was always that half smile, warm but shadowed. The kind of smile someone wears when they've buried too much to explain. He didn't own a smartphone, didn't care for the internet, read newspapers, wrote checks, no framed awards on the walls, no stories shared at the diner, just an old flag folded tight, a pair of boots by the door, and memories stored deep behind quiet eyes. He looked ordinary until someone tried to stop him. And Officer Dana Kelso, the rule follower, the justice seeker, found herself staring at a man the world had written off, only to discover he was written into a much larger story, one she wasn't trained to understand. Now she stood there, hand still hovering near her sidearm, as an entire unit of soldiers saluted a man she'd mistaken for a nobody. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of history, of sacrifice, of a past carried not in medals or speeches, but in the calloused hands of an old farmer who rode his Harley like it was still 1970 and he had a country to serve. And all Dana could think was, what else have I been blind to? She earned the nickname By the Book Kelso for good reason. Dana Kelso wore her uniform with exacting precision. Crisp lines, polished boots, and every citation documented without fail. Her reports were models of clarity, her paperwork flawless. Discipline wasn't just part of her job, it was her identity. But that same rigidity sometimes came at the cost of empathy. She wasn't heartless, just firmly convinced that emotions had no place interfering with duty. Order, rules, and procedure were her shields against chaos. Her new partner, Officer Trey Daniels, couldn't have been more different. At 34, Trey had a laid-back demeanor that bordered on too casual for Dana's liking, but even she had to admit, he got results. He had a natural charisma that put people at ease, even when they had something to hide. Raised in nearby Billings, Trey knew every hidden alley, every mom-and-pop diner, and just about every local by their high school nickname. He had nearly a decade of service under his belt and had seen the kind of local politics Dana hadn't yet encountered. Quiet feuds, unspoken loyalties, and the subtle power dynamics that often carried more weight than any badge. Still out in the field, Trey deferred to Dana. She had the edge, the sharp instinct for procedure, and the kind of unwavering presence that demanded respect. She never missed a detail and never hesitated. He admired that, even if he thought she relied too much on policy and too little on instinct. Dana respected Trey too, his calm, his experience, but she held firm in her belief that soft edges led to blurred lines, and blurred lines led to dangerous mistakes. Rules were armor. That's what she believed. So when she noticed an old man sitting on a rusted Harley at a red light just a few seconds too long, she didn't pause to wonder why. She didn't assume fatigue or reflection. Her training kicked in. Something was off, and when things felt off, she acted. What she didn't realize was that stillness isn't always hesitation. Sometimes it's the silence that comes before a lesson, one strong enough to shake the ground beneath everything you think you know. The low, steady growl of Franklin Boon's vintage Harley rumbled through Main Street, breaking the still morning like distant thunder. The bike wasn't fast anymore. Age had slowed it down, but it was solid, dependable, just like the man riding it. He brought the bike to a stop in front of Marty's Corner, an old gas station that had served the town since the late 1960s. Not much had changed there. Hand-painted signs, a soda fridge that buzzed like it was still running on borrowed time, and a red bench where locals sipped coffee and traded stories. The scent of diesel, warm pavement, and freshly brewed coffee filled the air as Franklin eased the bike onto its stand. His movements were deliberate, steady. He didn't remove his helmet, not yet. He didn't plan to stay long, just enough time to top off the tank before heading back to the fields before the sun rose too high. But fate, as it tends to do, had other ideas. The sharp screech of tires on gravel sliced through the quiet. A black and white patrol cruiser veered into the lot faster than necessary, kicking up a cloud of dust. Officer Dana Kelso emerged first, sunglasses reflecting the morning sun, her jaw set like concrete. Behind her, Officer Trey Daniels stepped out more slowly, adjusting his belt and quietly assessing the scene. Dana moved in. "Sir," she called out, her voice flat, professional, "can you shut that engine off, please?" Franklin didn't turn around immediately. He looked at her through the side mirror, then calmly flipped the switch. The Harley fell silent. The tension didn't. "Mind telling me where you're headed this morning?" Dana continued, stepping closer. "And can I see your license and registration?" Without a word, Franklin reached into his weathered leather jacket and pulled out a worn wallet. His hands were steady, unbothered, as he handed her the documents. His face remained unreadable. No fear, no indignation, just a calm silence that didn't yield anything. Dana scanned the license, her brows tightening. 82 years old, she muttered under her breath, just loud enough for Trey to hear. "Sir, don't you think it's a little dangerous for someone your age to be riding a machine like this?" Franklin said nothing. Trey shifted slightly, but didn't interrupt. Dana gestured toward the Harley. "This bike doesn't exactly look road safe either. When was the last time it was inspected?" Still, Franklin didn't respond. No protest, no reaction. His hands rested on his knees. His eyes weren't on her. They were fixed beyond her, toward the open road. Across the lot, behind the station's dusty glass windows, Marty Ellison stood frozen mid-pour. A Desert Storm veteran with a limp and a steel rod in his leg, Marty had run this station for nearly 20 years. He knew bikes, he knew soldiers, and he sure as hell knew Franklin Boon. Something was wrong. Marty leaned closer to the window, squinting. He'd never seen Franklin stop like that. Not for anyone. A cold instinct crawled up his spine. He reached for the landline behind the counter, the one that hadn't rung in 3 years, and dialed a number only a few locals even remembered. The operations desk at Camp Sheridan, 30 miles west. "This is Marty Ellison out at the corner stop," he said when the line clicked and someone answered. "I don't mean to raise alarm, but you might want to check your roster. There's an elderly man being questioned by 2 local officers. His name's Franklin Boon." There was silence. Then static crackled across the line, and something began to shift. The question hit like a bullet, sharp, immediate. "Did you say Colonel Boon?" Marty gave a silent nod, invisible through the line. "Yes, sir. That's him. Don't let anything happen to him. We're mobilizing now." The call ended abruptly. Marty stood there, the phone still pressed to his ear, for a beat too long, then slowly lowered it. His gaze returned to the same spot, unmoving. Franklin Boon, sitting quietly outside. The old man hadn't stirred, hadn't twitched a muscle, but the world around him was already shifting. Back at the gas station, Montana's morning air held a deceptive peace. Birds chirped lazily from the overhead wires. A distant tractor rumbled along a dirt road. Nothing screamed crisis, not unless you saw Marty Ellison's face through the glass of the convenience store window. Tense, locked, like a soldier waiting for the whistle of mortar fire. Inside the small booth, he stood frozen, the phone's warmth lingering in his calloused palm. His chest rose and fell with deliberate control, but his heart beat the same wild rhythm it had back in Kuwait. Marty wasn't the kind of man who panicked. He had seen real chaos, real war. But there had been something in the tone of the officer on the line, urgent, sharp-edged, almost rattled, that told him this was no longer a matter for local law enforcement. 30 meters away in the command center of Camp Sheridan, Sergeant Major Lisa Grant had just hung up the secure line. She moved with sudden, practiced urgency, the kind of speed no one had seen from her in years. She snapped toward a nearby junior officer. "Get Captain Graves. Tell him it's Boone. Colonel Franklin Boon. Situation's live. Deploy transport and security. Now." Yes, Sergeant," the young man stuttered, bolting out of the room. Grant sat down heavily, her breath sharp, shoulders tight. "Of all people," she muttered to herself, "Boone." She hadn't forgotten him. None of them had. Not because he ever sought attention, he didn't, but because he had that rare presence, the kind that made even the most hardened general unconsciously straighten their posture. Boon didn't need to command with volume. A glance from him could cut deeper than a reprimand. It made you want to rise to your best. Most of the officers now serving had once stood beneath his command. If small-town cops were hassling that man in public, this wasn't going to end with a quiet apology and a handshake. Back at the bomb station, something in the atmosphere shifted. Nothing obvious, just a subtle tilt in the air, like pressure before a storm. Outside, Officer Dana Kelso handed back the driver's license, her expression firm, her tone edged with unease. "Sir, I asked you a question. Are you headed somewhere in particular today?" Franklin Boon finally met her eyes. He didn't glare, he didn't plead, but the weight behind his gaze was unmistakable. The kind of weight born of decades watching nations crumble, wars erupt and peace fracture, then watching the world forget what it all cost. "I'm getting fuel," he said flatly. Dana narrowed her eyes, her voice sharpening. "That's not what I asked." To her, his tone felt defiant, dismissive. It grated. Her partner, Officer Trey Daniels, glanced toward the convenience store and noticed Marty was no longer at the window. Something twisted in his gut. The air had changed. Dana pressed on. "Sir, we may need to take you in for a wellness check. Your responses are slow, and frankly, this motorcycle doesn't appear roadworthy." Franklin didn't even blink. "It runs just fine." Trey opened his mouth. "Dana, maybe we should—" She cut him off with a raised hand. "I've got this." But the truth was she didn't. Under their feet came a subtle vibration, barely there, like a hum in the bones. Then the sound grew. A low, rising thunder, earth, rubber, steel. Dana turned her head, her brow knit. Dust began to unfurl along the horizon like smoke. And then, from the bend in the road, they appeared. Humvees. Not one, not two, 12. They came fast, kicking up gravel, lined in tight formation. Each vehicle bore the seal of the U.S. Army, shining clear under the morning sun. Soldiers sat inside, focused, still, unshaken. The lead vehicle flew a flag. None of them slowed until they were almost on top of the gas station. Then all 12 stopped together as if pulled by a single command, tires locking into place with thunderous precision. Dana's hand moved instinctively to her sidearm, not out of hostility, just the reflex of a cop feeling suddenly very, very out of her depth. Franklin Boon didn't move. Just then, Marty stepped out from the store, drying his hands with a rag, his eyes wide as he watched soldiers spill from the vehicles with eerie synchronization. From the lead Humvee emerged a tall man, salt and pepper hair neatly cropped, his posture unmistakable. He walked with purpose, eyes locked on Boon, and then turned to face the two officers. He raised his hand in a crisp salute. "Who dared to stop Colonel Boon?" His voice cracked through the tension like a thunderclap. "Who dared to stop Colonel Boon?" Silence followed. Thick, suffocating. Dana froze. Her fingers hovered near her holster, not out of threat, but out of confusion. That wasn't a warning. That wasn't a challenge. That was reverence, laced with something close to awe. She turned slowly. The man stood proud, his dress greens immaculate, rows of ribbons and medals like a timeline of war. His face bore the marks of command, creases from field orders, losses, and hard-won victories. But his posture was razor straight, boots planted, chin high. He stepped forward again, and this time his salute was for Boon. "Colonel Boon," he said, his voice soft now. "Sir, we came as fast as we could." Boon gave the faintest nod, not a greeting, an acknowledgement, the kind of nod soldiers understood without needing words. The kind that said, "I see you, I hear you, let's get to work." The decades between them melted away in silence that needed no words. Behind Captain Nolan Graves, the last of the soldiers stepped from the idling Humvees, falling into formation with disciplined precision. 50 in total, not there for intimidation, but to stand behind a man they owed their lives to. Each movement was sharp, deliberate, not for show, but born from muscle memory instilled by the man at the heart of it all, Boon. Their presence wasn't a warning, it was a shield. Captain Graves shifted his attention to the two officers standing stiffly by the patrol car. His eyes locked onto them with the gravity of a man used to commanding entire battalions. "I'm Captain Nolan Graves, U.S. Army. I'm the one who gave the order to halt this man. Dana took a cautious step forward, trying to recover from the wave of uncertainty crashing through here. Her voice trembled at first, but steadied under the weight of protocol. Officer Dana Kelso, local patrol, we stopped him due to concerns for his safety and the condition of his vehicle. Graves didn't need to raise his voice. His mere presence demanded attention. Did he break any laws? Dana glanced at her citation pad, fingers tightening. No, sir, she'd admitted. Did he resist? Threaten? Refuse to comply? Dana hesitated. Her memory tried to pin down the exact moment. He didn't speak at first. He was uncooperative. Graves took a step forward. The soldiers behind him responded in unison, a unified wall, not with hostility, but with reverence. Their movement wasn't a threat. It was loyalty made visible. This man, Graves began, his voice firm, served in 3 wars: Vietnam, Desert Storm, Afghanistan. He trained generations of soldiers, myself included. He holds 2 Silver Stars, a Distinguished Service Cross, and more battlefield commendations than the entire police department in this town combined. He paused just briefly, the emotion swelling in his voice as he pressed forward. He doesn't talk much because he's seen more than most men could endure. He doesn't react quickly because he learned the hard way that sudden reactions get soldiers killed. His voice dropped, almost reverent. That motorcycle you mocked? He rode that same Harley through the streets of Saigon the day the last units were evacuated. That bike isn't rust, it's living history. Dana's face turned pale. Her gaze flicked to Boon, who hadn't moved an inch. He stood with quiet dignity, his silence louder than any defense she could imagine. I didn't know, she said softly. No, Graves said with quiet intensity. You didn't, but maybe you should have asked before assuming. By now, the handful of locals who'd gathered had begun recording, but the tone had shifted. Phones weren't raised to ridicule anymore. They were trying to capture a moment of reverence, of awakening. Boon moved at last. With slow, deliberate grace, he swung his leg off the bike and stood tall. He didn't speak with anger, didn't show arrogance. He simply turned to Dana and said, "Respect isn't a uniform. It's how you carry yourself." There was no scolding in his tone, only a quiet truth, a lesson etched in years of service and sacrifice. Graves looked back to him. Sir, would you like an escort home? Boon shook his head slowly. I think the lesson's loud enough. He climbed back onto his Harley. The engine rumbled to life with a sound that wasn't just mechanical. It was a heartbeat from another time. As he rolled forward, the 50 soldiers snapped to attention and parted, forming a path of honor. Colonel Boon rode on through the parting ranks, leaving behind a trail of dust and something far heavier. Even after the Harley's roar faded into the horizon, silence clung to the street like morning fog. Officer Dana Kelso remained rooted in place, her throat tight. She couldn't tell if it was dust or something deeper that stung her eyes. Around her, the soldiers began to regroup, returning to formation with a quiet solemnity. But the air hadn't cleared. Not yet. Captain Graves lingered, his boots unmoving on the asphalt. He turned toward the small crowd by the curb, dozens now. Ordinary people who had shown up expecting to witness a stubborn old man put in his place. What they got instead was a glimpse of living legacy. I know you're all wondering who he is, Graves said. He didn't speak to the cameras, but to the faces behind them. So let me tell you. He hesitated, not for effect, but out of respect. For Boone, for the silence the man lived by. Colonel Franklin Boon is one of the last men alive who served in 3 major American wars: Vietnam, Desert Storm, and Afghanistan. But even more than that, he was what we in the military call a quiet commander. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to demand. But when he walked into a room, you stood taller. You listened closer. You knew you were in the presence of a man who had led soldiers through hell and brought them back alive. Next to Dana, Officer Trey Daniels lowered his head. Graves went on, his voice unwavering. He was among the first special operations trainers at Fort Bragg. Over his career, he personally mentored over 300 officers, many of whom now wear stars on their shoulders. He's been wounded in combat twice, refused medical retirement both times, turned down medals too, said they belonged to the ones who didn't make it home. A murmur passed through the crowd. Grief, awe, maybe even guilt. He's the reason I joined, Graves added quietly. When I was just a recruit, arrogant, raw, he didn't break me down. He made me believe I could be better. And he did that for hundreds, maybe thousands. A voice piped up from the crowd, a teenager no older than 17. Why doesn't anyone know him? Why isn't his name in history books? Graves gave a small, sad smile. Because he didn't want it to be. The truth hit Dana like a stone dropped into still water. She hadn't stopped him because he posed a threat. She stopped him for being quiet, for being old, for riding a motorcycle that looked worn by time. But time hadn't worn Boon down. It had refined him into something the world rarely noticed anymore, an invisible kind of hero. The kind who didn't ask to be remembered because he never acted for recognition. He acted for duty. And today, finally, the world had seen him. Every fiber of that man might have seemed too worn for her standards, too rugged, too raw, but there was something about him that no amount of training could teach. He was forged from duty and discipline, the kind etched into the skin, not written in textbooks. Captain Graves was looking at her now, not with anger or accusation, but with something deeper, intention. Officer Kelso, he said, his voice low but firm, not a confrontation, but a lesson. You didn't act out of malice. You followed protocol. But protocol doesn't always recognize valor, especially when it comes wrapped in denim and leather. That's why we have to do more. It's not just about rules. It's about the people, the stories behind the faces. Dana's chest tightened. Her eyes didn't leave his. I understand, sir, she replied, her voice small but honest. I was wrong. Captain Graves gave a single nod before turning to the soldiers behind him. With mechanical precision, they began climbing back into the Humvees, engines rumbling to life like synchronized heartbeats. But the crowd didn't move. They stood still, almost reverent. Something had shifted, not just how they saw Franklin Boon, but how they saw all men like him. Men who bore scars silently, who never asked to be honored, only understood. From that day forward, in that small Montana town, Colonel Boon's name would no longer be overlooked. It wouldn't just be a whisper among veterans or a plaque gathering dust. It would be remembered, carried in conversations, in respect, in the way people paused before jumping to conclusions. By the time the last Humvee disappeared down the sun-faded road, the buzz had already started. Cell phone footage, shaky and raw, was uploaded to Facebook in minutes. By nightfall, Colonel Boon was trending across the state. By the next day, regional news outlets were running headlines like, "Veteran mistaken for vagrant, honored by military convoy." Inside the Billings County Sheriff's Department, the phone lines lit up like Christmas. Some callers were angry, some were inspired, some just wanted answers. But one call changed everything. It came just after 8:00 a.m., and Sheriff Les McAdams answered it himself. He was a man shaped by decades of service, wide-shouldered and weather-tested, unflinching even under political firestorms and icy Montana winters. But this call carried a different weight. "This is Captain Nolan Graves," the voice on the line said. "We need to talk. Not about punishment, about partnership." It was a short conversation, no threats, no legal posturing. Boon wasn't pressing charges. Graves wasn't interested in blame. But the meaning was clear. This could never happen again. Not in their town, not to their veterans. By noon, McAdams had called an emergency department meeting. Every officer was there, sitting quietly in metal folding chairs around the precinct's break room. The usual chatter and caffeine buzz were absent. Unfinished coffee sat cooling in paper cups. At the front stood Sheriff McAdams. Seated beside him was Officer Dana Kelso, her posture upright, uniform crisp, but her gaze heavy with reflection. McAdams scanned the room. "I'm not here to point fingers," he said evenly, "but I won't pretend what happened was okay. We made a mistake, a serious one. A man who's risked his life more times than any of us can count was treated like a threat. Not a person, not a hero." He looked at Dana and gave her a slight nod. She stood slowly. Her voice was clear, but her eyes carried the weight of recognition. "I stopped a man because he was older, because his bike looked unsafe, because he didn't respond the way I expected." she began. "I thought I was protecting him, protecting the town. But the truth is, I never gave him the chance to be more than a profile. I never asked who he was, I just assumed." She glanced around the room. Some officers nodded slowly, others stared into their laps. "I didn't just stop a veteran," she continued. "I stopped someone who embodied everything this badge is supposed to stand for. I've apologized to Colonel Boon directly, but that's not enough. I want to do more." McAdams stepped forward again. "Starting today, we're doing things differently. We're partnering with Camp Sheridan to develop new training, not just to recognize signs of military service, but to teach respect, patience, and listening before acting." It wasn't empty talk. By the following week, every officer, rookies and seasoned veterans alike, stood shoulder to shoulder on the training grounds of Camp Sheridan. They learned about veteran culture, about trauma-informed communication, about reading between the silences. Dana came every day, not just as a student, but as a volunteer. She asked the hard questions. She listened harder to the answers. She began to understand what she'd never been taught in any academy: the difference between stillness and resistance, between silence and pain, between suspicion and history. It didn't take long for the culture to change. Officers began asking stories before asking for IDs. They asked, "Where did you serve?" instead of, "What are you doing here?" The tone shifted. The posture softened. Respect became instinct, not a checkbox. And for Dana Kelso, that shift was deeply personal. Once you've looked into the eyes of a man like Colonel Franklin Boon and seen the battles that still live behind them, you never see a stranger on a motorcycle again. You see a story waiting to be heard. Nearly a week had passed since that morning at Marty's gas station. The viral headlines were fading. The phone calls had slowed. Life in the quiet corners of Montana had returned to its familiar rhythm. But Dana hadn't moved on. She had stood through every minute of training. She had listened to war stories, some shared with laughter, others with trembling hands. And each day, she carried something new back into her patrol car, not just knowledge, but understanding, humility, humanity. Because some lessons, the most important ones, aren't learned in classrooms or manuals. They're learned when you stop seeing uniforms, or the lack of them, and start seeing people. On a morning brushed with a faint chill and not a hint of wind, Dana pulled her cruiser off the main road and eased down a gravel driveway lined with sprawling open fields. Cattle grazed lazily, unbothered by the sound of tires crunching over stone. At the end of the lane stood a modest white farmhouse with peeling paint, a rusted tin roof that caught the dull light of morning, and a small barn slouched to one side. A wind chime on the porch moved gently, as if remembering breezes that no longer came. Beneath a large cottonwood tree, partially shaded, sat a Harley Davidson, its chrome faintly reflecting the rising sun. Not far from it, a green John Deere tractor stood mid-repair. Its hood gaped open like it had been caught mid-sentence. Dana parked by the wooden fence, her heart heavy, her mind still restless despite days of reflection. She took a breath, one meant to settle the conflict between duty and emotion, and stepped out. He saw her before she could say a word. Colonel Franklin Boon stood in oil-smudged coveralls, sleeves rolled, hands stained with grease. He didn't retreat. He didn't challenge her. He just straightened up beside the tractor and waited. "Colonel Boon," Dana said, her voice soft but steady as she made her way across the dirt path. "May I have a word with you?" Without a trace of resentment, he wiped his hands on an old faded rag, gave a small nod, and motioned toward the house. "Coffee's fresh," he said simply. Inside, the scent of cedar mingled with the strong aroma of black coffee. The furniture was humble, worn in the way things are when they've seen life but been cared for. On a shelf rested a carefully folded American flag, and beside it, a photo of a woman whose eyes sparkled like she once laughed at all his worst jokes. They sat at a wooden kitchen table, mugs mismatched, hands curled around ceramic warmth. Dana tried to find the words. He gave her space. He didn't fill the silence. "I just wanted to say thank you," she began, eyes low, "and that I'm sorry. Sorry I didn't see you for who you are." Boone looked out the window at the open field where the wind still refused to blow. "You saw what most folks see," he said, voice calm. "An old man with a machine that doesn't shine anymore. You were trained to see threats, not stories. That's not on you. She swallowed hard. But I judged you, she admitted, her voice cracking ever so slightly. He met her eyes, unwavering. And then you learned. That's what matters. She let his words settle, like the coffee warming her hands. Can I ask something? She said more gently now. Why didn't you ever tell anyone who you were? Boone's lips curved into something like a smile, but not of pride, more like understanding. Because what I did, he said, that's not who I am. And respect, that's not something you put on like a uniform. It's something you give. And with that, the moment became a lesson, not dressed in ceremony or medals, but in quiet mercy. Colonel Franklin Boon had never asked for recognition, never sought applause or praise, and yet, somehow, the man who spoke the least had become the loudest voice reminding them all what true dignity looked like. In the weeks after the incident, something subtle but powerful began to shift around town. People started seeing things, and people, differently. An old man slowly crossing the street? Maybe he wasn't just in the way. Maybe he once cleared paths for others. A worn leather jacket? Maybe it wasn't just old. Maybe it carried pieces of history stitched into every crease. Dana Kelso remained on the force, but she wasn't the same officer. She began leading with questions instead of commands. She listened before she acted. And whenever she passed a veteran, her posture changed slightly, not out of guilt, but understanding. As for Colonel Boon, his life on the farm went on just as it always had. The Harley still rumbled at sunrise. The tractor still broke down. He still rose before the light and drank his coffee black. But something had changed, not within him, but in the people who waved as he rode by. They didn't wave out of pity anymore. They waved out of respect. And maybe that's the truest lesson of all. Not every hero carries a rifle or wears a ribbon. Some heroes sit on porches, fixing tractors, sipping coffee, or riding a bike older than the officer who pulls them over. Because service doesn't end when the war does. Sometimes the real heroes are already standing quietly in our lives. So now ask yourself, have you ever misjudged someone only to learn later they carried a story that shook your heart? Have you ever met someone, a neighbor, a janitor, a stranger, who turned out to be more heroic than anyone imagined? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if this story moves something in you, please give it a like, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who still believes in dignity, humility, and honor. Thank you for being here and for remembering that sometimes the quietest voices carry the deepest truths.